I'm going to try to give you sort of a concise summary of kind of the facts and the history of the Bauhaus school in Germany around the 1920s and how it led to what we consider modern product design. As we go through this, I think some things to keep in mind. I think it's reasonable to think of it this way. There were sort of three main drivers of innovation at the Bauhaus school. First, you can think this was right after, it opened originally right after World War I, and there was a great feeling of hope for, societal improvements and things in Germany following World War I. And so as a country, Germany was willing to invest in developments of education. So part of it was this sort of optimism after World War I. Another big thing was that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, German industry was having trouble keeping up with American and British industry in international markets. So the struggles of German industry were sort of leading people to look for a new way to approach the creation of products. And then German industry struggles is what I meant to say here. And then at the same time that there was this reason to innovate in industry, there were big changes happening in the world of fine arts. Photography was changing what painting meant, what sculpture meant, and people were trying to figure out how art was going to fit into this new world. Another, I wouldn't call it a driver of innovation exactly, but a thread that's going to come up through this story is, so a big part of this story is the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. And the Nazi Party kind of was against the Bauhaus school for a couple of main reasons. You can just imagine, the Nazi Party generally against the spirit of art students and professors. There was just major philosophical differences, and the school had a lot of left-wing influence. And so the Nazis were against that part of the school. The other thing that led to the conflicts between the Nazis and the Bauhaus was that the Nazis were in favor of this this feeling of pride about traditional German products, furniture, design, and the Bauhaus was kind of turning all of this on its head. So the products that were coming out of the Bauhaus themselves were just, and the architecture were just against what the Nazis were, in favor of. So it sort of started around the turn of the century. In 1907, the German Workbund was formed. This was just a federation of workers. And it was in reaction to the fact that, like I said, German industry wasn't doing well in international markets. And so it was a collection of architects, artists, and industrialists that came together to try to solve this problem. 1907 was before World War I, and, this German Workbund stayed together until World War I started, and then there was sort of this hiatus. World War I lasted from 1914 to 1918. And in 1919, now the war is over, one of the Workbund founders recommended an architect named Walter Gropius. To take over an art school in Weimar, and to bring sort of this collaborative spirit of the Workbund to this art school, to make it kind of incorporate industrial arts in with the fine arts. So they recommended Walter Gropius to take over an art school in Weimar, Germany, and to incorporate crafts, people, and industrial arts. And at this point, there really wasn't anything called design. There wasn't this idea that that different industries had this thing in common where somebody could look at the requirements and try to create something that sort of beautifully, aesthetically captured what needed to be built. And so this school was given a new name, and the name of this school was the Bauhaus. That means build house. And it's interesting that although, it was, they sort of advertised this idea of building things, the faculty was really artists for almost entirely. And you'll see art have a major focus in this school always. And this Bauhaus school lasted from 1919 until 1933, although we'll see there were many changes during that time. The Bauhaus was from the start publicly funded. And there were many famous artists on the faculty right from the start. And these were artists. The two best known were Vasily Kandinsky, who was a Russian artist, sort of a modern artist, and the German Paul Klee. The faculty settled on this, sort of new curriculum, experimental type curriculum. And so the way the education worked was for the first 6 months, the students took an introductory course. And at the start, the professor of this course was Johannes Itten. That's also quite a famous name. And this focused on just introducing the very basic concepts of art to students, in a way sort of like bringing them back to the beginning so that everybody could be given kind of the same grounding from, the start. So this focused just on color, shape, texture, and movement. once this 6-month introductory course was over, the students moved on to what I think is generally considered to be the sort of the heart of their education at the Bauhaus. And this is when they chose a workshop. And the workshops were where they really got hands-on experience in what was kind of their concentration. And the workshops that were available, well, they changed from year to year, but this is a pretty good list of what was available while the Bauhaus was open. Ceramics, weaving, carpentry, printing and advertising, metalwork, stage design, sculpture, joinery, like largely with wood, like you would use for putting together furniture, stained glass, wall painting, and photography. Then after the workshop experience was over, a select number of students were selected for this final phase, which was called building. And this is where the students would be tasked with creating things, creating objects, using the products of the workshops. And so having all of those workshops in the same school, you can see there's sort of this multidisciplinary focus where people were encouraged to use sculpture along with weaving, along with, furniture design. So this was the structure of the school from the start. The city of Weimar wasn't a very good fit for the Bauhaus because it was sort of a conservative, traditional city. And so in 1925, the Bauhaus moved to Dessau, Germany. And in Dessau, Walter Gropius, the head of the school, who was an architect, designed the new school building, which is a very famous building that's still standing. It's a UNESCO heritage site. And I'll show you a picture of the outside of that building. This building was unusual at the time. There were a lot of open spaces. There was a bridge between two sections of the building where you could oversee what was happening in large parts of the other part of the school. So it sort of added to this feeling of collaboration between the different parts of the school. There was faculty housing and student housing on the same grounds. And so there's a picture of the famous Bauhaus building with characteristic sort of slate gray walls and the red door. Again, in Dessau, eventually problems with the beginnings of the Nazi Party started to cause problems. Gropius left because he felt like he was part of the tension. And so in 1928, Walter Gropius left And the new head of the school was an even more famous architect, named Hannes Meyer. And because the political conflicts were causing issues with public funding, this was a period where the Bauhaus started to really seek outside funding and collaboration with local industry. They started looking for architectural contracts. And some of the architecture that was produced with the help of the Bauhaus is still very famous. So this was a period where the school was moving away from fine art and toward more focus on product design, product creation. The conflict kept getting worse until in 1930, the mayor of the city of Dessau called for Meyer to be fired. So Meyer was out. And the new head of the school was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. This is an R. And by this time, the writing was sort of on the wall. Eventually, this school was going to be closed down. The Nazis took control of Dessau in 1931. And in 1932, the school was closed. They did move briefly to Berlin as a private school, so now there was no public funding. But then in 1933, the school closed for good. But during the 14 years that the Bauhaus was open, there were many products created there that have become famous objects in the history of product design. So there were many famous products created. Many of the ones that I'm going to show you here are still for sale, still very popular, 100 years later. And so let me just give you, I think I have 9 or 10 of these pictures of famous products that came out of the Bauhaus. The first are 2 chairs, and in both of these, you can see the multiple materials used. Furniture at the time was very heavy and ornate with a lot of decoration on it. You can see how these 2 objects moved away from that. This one is called the Vasily chair. Named after Kandinsky. And this one is called the Barcelona chair. This is a new doorknob design that was created by Gropius. A totally new look compared to round doorknobs, and obviously the this is used all the time now, this sort of basic structure. This is a new chess set created by Joseph Hartwig. You can see that all the military and religious symbols are removed from the usual chess pieces, and they're replaced with simple shapes that show really the ability of the piece to move. So, for example, like the knights have the shape of the motion of the knight. The queen has the round top, indicating basically, unlimited movement, and so on. Here's a pattern from the weaving workshop. This is a set of colorful nesting tables. It's interesting, funny, that these tables were designed by Joseph Albers, and this weave pattern above was created by his wife, Annie Albers, in the weaving workshop. Notice that a lot of what was interesting about the furniture we've seen, these nesting tables, the chairs, is that compared to what was available before, they take up very little space. They can be there when you need them and then be tucked away when you don't need them. They don't obscure the view or the use of the rest of the room. Here's a teapot created by Marianne Brandt. And you can see that compared to what you can imagine would have come before, there's a focus on combining simple shapes. Here's a famous desk lamp, and this brings up sort of a funny thing that sometimes came up with the Bauhaus, was that their intention was to design products that would be amenable to industrial production, but one of the weaknesses was these artists didn't have that much of a basis in how companies would go about making products, and sometimes they made things that were said to look industrial, but if you actually had to produce them in volume, it would be really hard to do, and that was sort of a knock against this, but you can see the combination of simple shapes. One of the workshops was involved in printing, and one of the most enduring things about the Bauhaus is the type fonts that came out. And compared to the German fonts, so I'm just showing this to see the fonts. The German fonts that were used before the Bauhaus were very flowery with a lot of decoration, very extreme Gothic sort of calligraphy fonts. The Bauhaus took away a lot of the decoration, just sort of reduced it down to its simple form. And there's still a big influence of these fonts on fonts that we use today. And then I just wanted to show one painting. There was some fine art done at the Bauhaus and some famous art. And this painting by Oscar Schlemmer depicts students at the Bauhaus, just going about their daily routine in the famous Bauhaus building, going up the stairs to class or whatever. And another thing, I think, what people normally think of as the stereotypical like Bauhaus look of products was before the Bauhaus, ornate decorations were very common. The Bauhaus people tended to do away with these ornate decorations and lean towards a more sort of form follows function approach. Where these products have the features they need to function and no extra stuff. Clearly, aesthetics was important to them. It was mostly artists, but they didn't tend to do elaborate things that didn't have a part in the function of the object. So form follows function. And then last, all these struggles with Nazi Germany, in a way, served a little bit of a purpose, because when the Bauhaus closed, all of these faculty who'd been exposed to these ideas for 14 years, so after the closing, those people moved all over the world to teach in different universities and work in different companies. The faculty and the students, former students. Walter Gropius moved to the U.S. and became head of the architecture department at Harvard. In Chicago, a school was opened called the New Bauhaus, created by some of the old faculty members. And we'll talk about one of the students who ended up being quite a famous architect and artist and designer in his own right. And so that spread across the world really had a big role in making this Bauhaus vision kind of an international design language. The Bauhaus closed in 1933, and that sort of led into World War II. You know, Germany was sort of in the middle of all that stuff already in 1933. So World War II took place between 1939 and 1945. And sort of the next chapter that grew out of the Bauhaus came after World War II, and that was the creation of the Ulm School of Design. Sometimes you'll see that abbreviated H, lowercase f, capital G. That's a German thing. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. And this school operated from 1953 to 1968 in Ulm, Germany. The head of the school at the start was a former student at the Bauhaus named Max Bill. And just like Walter Gropius had made this sort of innovative school building for the Dessau Bauhaus, Max Bill was the architect who created the school building for the Ulm School of Design, and that's also a very famous building. And the faculty, right from the start at the Ulm School, included several faculty members from the Bauhaus. So there was definitely a sort of continuation of this mission at the Ulm School. While the mission of the Bauhaus had kind of, it wasn't always continuous what they felt like their mission was. There was a lot of art taught at the school. That was different at the Ulm School of Design. Art was not a topic. It was only used as part of sort of a product design goal. The curriculum at the Ulm School of Design in a way sort of followed the curriculum of the Bauhaus. It started out with an introductory course called the Basic Course. That focused on materials, presentation, and methods. And after the basic course was done, people moved on to their individual specialties. And like the Bauhaus, there were several of these as possibilities. One was product design, and this ended up being the most important, most influential at this school. Visual communication, which included writing fonts, advertisements, industrial building, and then the final topic was the person's graduation thesis. In 1956, so after about 3 years, Max Bill quit due to just conflicts in image of what this school would be. Max Bill was an artist primarily, and the school was moved in the direction by the new head, Thomas Maldonado, of focusing more on science, more of a technical focus, and away from an aesthetic focus. So this is when it moved to more science-based, technical focus at the school. One thing that Thomas Maldonado did as head is he increased the collaborations with industry. And so some with Max Bill there, but more after he left. There were products that were made by German companies that used designs created or at least worked on by the Ulm School of Design. So Maldonado increased collaboration with companies. And so I'm going to do the same thing now. I'm just going to give a series of pictures of some of their most famous designs that came out of the Ulm School of Design. The first two that I have here were a collaboration between Max Bill before he left the Ulm School and the German watch and clock maker Junghans. So this is a kitchen timer. Look at the cool fonts for the numbers. And then very similar, if you look at these numbers, the font is very similar on the wristwatches that he made. And all of these things are still, you can still buy them from this company, Junghans, today. This is a set of stackable dishes. Again, sort of like we saw with the Bauhaus designs, there's like a focus on being useful, fitting into a room, and being usable but not taking up space. You can see the influence this has on later companies like IKEA. The airline Lufthansa was founded in the 50s, and the Ulm School of Design did all of their commercial work and their logos and their fonts. And then finally, this is a record player radio by the German company Braun, spelled like Braun. And this was an old company, but they were sort of looking for a new identity. And so their sort of young designer went to work with the people at the Ulm School of Design, and they came up with this, which became a very famous design. And we're going to see that collaboration between Brown and the Ulm School really led to the identity of Brown for the next 50 years. So the next important step in this process, in the development of what we think of as modern design now, was the German company Brown. And their head designer, starting in the 50s and all the way up until almost the year 2000, was Dieter Rams. And Dieter Rams worked with the Ulm School of Design on this SK4 record player that I showed you above. After that collaboration, you really see that influence through his work for the rest of his career. You might think this is sort of funny, like I'm talking about this company Brown, and you're like, the nose hair trimmer company, you know, they make head shavers or whatever. That is the same company. In Germany, they're still a bigger company, but they did a lot of audio equipment. They did clocks and watches and kitchen appliances. It was a very big company. So originally, Rams worked with the Ulm School on this SK4 record player. At the time, audio equipment looked like furniture. It was big, ornate, heavy. This was a major departure from what people expected from audio equipment. Rams was not the only famous designer to work at Brown during that time. They had two other very famous names who've worked on other important products for other companies. And those are Dietrich Lubbs and Gerd A. Muller. And so I want to just show you again a list of popular product pictures that came out of Brown during this 50-year span from 1953 to around the turn of the century. I already showed you the record player, so I won't show you that again. Here's a portable radio, transistor radio, made in 1959. You can pretty clearly see the influence on Apple many decades later. Here's a kitchen mixer. This is a speaker cabinet. You can see how little space it takes up. And then the last one I have for you here is a travel alarm clock. They still sell something that looks remarkably like this as a travel alarm clock. That flap closes to protect the glass. Dieter Rams has been a very influential designer, and one of the things he's famous for is for encapsulating his design principles into a list of the 10 principles of good design. And so let me give those to you, and I think these are useful to think about as you're thinking about something that you're putting out into the world. So these are the 10 principles of good design. The first one is that it needs to be innovative. If it's not innovative, I guess you could argue that there's no real reason to put it out there in the first place. Second, it needs to be useful, not just something that catches the eye, but something that actually has a purpose in someone's life. Third, it has to be aesthetic. Fourth, it has to be understandable. And you can think of that as simple to use. Fifth, it has to be unobtrusive. So when it's not being used, it's not in the way. Sixth, I think this is an interesting one, it needs to be honest. So it's not trying to be something that it isn't. It's not making promises that in functioning it can't back up. Not trying to be what it's not. Seventh, it has to be long-lasting. And thinking about a design as long-lasting really means that its aesthetics have to endure over time. And I think that's a big part of this movement towards less decorated objects. Any decoration can go out of fashion. That happens all the time. But if everything on the object is required for its function, there's really no way for it to go out of fashion other than it not to be useful any longer. 8, it has to be thorough down to the last detail. So every part of it needs to be carefully thought out. 9, it has to be environmentally friendly. It's interesting that this list was made in the 70s. Back then, environmentally friendly mostly meant not making products that are going to be thrown away regularly and filling up landfills and stuff like that. But it seems very timely for today. And then 10, it needs to be as little design as possible. And in other words, it needs to be as simple as it can possibly be to get the job done. And I think all of this stuff that happened in Germany toward, in the last half of, or I guess throughout the 20th century, I think really explains where our sort of current corporate industrial design language comes from. I mentioned companies like Apple and IKEA before, but you can clearly see the thought process coming from the Bauhaus and the Ulm School and the Brown Company.